Collective. Tonight we are starting our 3-part series on Cassandra Speaks, this wonderful book by Elizabeth Lesser that we have Deb to thank for this beautiful recommendation. For anybody who's tuning in for the first time, I'm Randall Ulyate, founder and director of Fernway Collective. And I am a mythological studies professor. I will admit Eve is not my specialty, but I'm certainly very interested in her story. Kiese, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Kiese Hill, and I actually teach high school, but I'm a mythological studies PhD candidate who is working on Eve because my dissertation is on John Milton's Paradise Lost. And
is that me? Okay, hi. I'm Deborah Maroulis.
I know, like the Brady Bunch squares. I don't know where to.
No, I feel like we should.
Just kidding. Like, I don't know who's over there. So.
Right.
I'm Deborah Maroulis, and I am an adjunct professor, and I teach mythology. I have a mythological studies PhD candidate as well. And Eve is not my specialty either, although because I am an Enneagram 1 and a Virgo, I have spent all day reading a lot. So, which, by the way, I'm going to send you this book, Kiese, because I think you will really like it. They actually quote it quite a bit. And so I was thinking of you all day reading that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm very excited for this because, as you guys know, I love Cassandra Speaks. This book has spoken to me. Cassandra has spoken to me. And it's changed.
But did you believe her? Did you believe her?
You know, I did. I chose to. I took a chance. Yeah. But I just loved this book. It changed the whole way that I viewed a woman's role in the world. I mean, I've always known the struggles and the patriarchal attitudes. Elizabeth Lesser talks about the patriarchy as a word is not a good word because it forces all men into one way and all women into another. And there needs to be more of that combination, which, you know, I'm preaching to the choir here, right? And you guys will probably talk about it later, but this book made me see the patriarchal waters we goldfish were swimming in, and I couldn't figure out how to do that before. So I'm very excited to talk about it.
I love the way you phrase that. There's a book that I love that we'll have to do on one of these nights called Ishmael by Daniel Quinn, and he does address the Adam and Eve myth. Mm-hmm. And he identifies culture as these waters that we're swimming in, that we only notice our culture and our cultural narratives once we're removed from the situation, and that water is no longer there like a fish flopping on the shore. Mm-hmm. And I really like that analogy, so I like how you use it.
Well, I think to say something about Fernway, I think that's the really important thing about travel, right? Is that, of course, we're going to still be in this situation in this time, but it's dramatically different as you travel around the world and you at least try to understand or comprehend and dive into someone else's culture. Mm-hmm. As long as you don't travel at the Hyatt, and this is where I'm going to be on my soapbox, but travel at the Hyatt eating at McDonald's every day.
Hey, the McDonald's menu is different in Greece.
I was going to say,
it's true, but I still think
McDonald's is such an interesting like barometer of culture, though. When I travel,
it is.
That's true.
When I travel, I tend to travel really cheaply, and I stay at hostels that, like, well, now I'm in my mid-30s and I'm a mom, so I seek a little more comfort than I used to in my 20s. But McDonald's was always a place that had free internet that I could go to and not worry about getting hassled.
Nice.
And so I started like noticing all the differences in the menus at McDonald's around the world. And now it's like something I seek out because it's this symbol of American culture that is it manifests so differently, like Christian syncretism, like it meets people where they're at all around the world. Like in China, you can get a taro pie instead of an apple pie.
I know.
And in
McDonald's and Christian syncretism.
I know. Well, it worked.
Hey, we're in Randall's world now.
I like it. I like it. Well, you know when you're talking to a nerd when. Like,
okay, shots fired. And in Egypt, they have a mikarabia, which is like a burger flatbread wrap. I mean, it's just, and in the Netherlands, they have bitterballen. Sure. It's just so interesting to see how they totally adapt to
when I travel
cultures.
Chico, I just get bread and Nutella. That like bread and cheese. That's that was my college travel cheap. So I didn't. McDonald's was too fancy for me.
Very fancy. Okay. Fancy. Now, I guess that's a good segue. Fanciness.
Can I make a recommendation that one of you tell the Cassandra story, since that is the title of our book?
Yeah, we can go into Cassandra a little bit. We're talking about her.
Oh, you're talking about her later.
Yeah, but I think it's a good idea to introduce it and talk about why we're even, having these conversations. Elizabeth Lesser tells at the beginning of the book, she tells a story of how she's in a lunchroom. She's feeling very frustrated about being a woman leader and a single mom. And she comes across and she paints a picture of this old, wise woman slurping soup and it getting all over her. She's just so engrossed in what she's doing. And you almost see that like the female version of Dumbledore, right? Sitting at this table. And she's talking to this woman, and because Elizabeth Lesser is sitting there like, so how are you enjoying your stay? And the professor's like, how is your life? Explain. And like, the eyes. And so she's like, oh, and she just starts telling her. She's like, well, I really, I don't like what I'm doing. Nobody listens to me. I'm trying to get things done in my company that I started. And, I'm fighting with these guys all the time. And then she's like, well, that reminds me of Cassandra's story. Cassandra was a daughter of Sparta, right? Sparta. Yeah. And she Zeus fell in love with her. And then of course, Apollo also fell in love with her because she was so gorgeous. And she didn't really want either of them. And so Apollo was hitting on her and was like, I'm going to beat out my dad, right? So he gives her the gift of prophecy. Like, look what I can give you if you will be mine. And she's like, yeah, I'm good, bro, but thanks. And he's like, ha.
So her love language wasn't gift giving?
No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't at all. Although maybe it just wasn't the right gift. I don't know. Maybe she was more materialistic than prophecy. I don't know. It is, yeah. So she she turns Apollo down, and so he gets angry, and so he spits in her mouth, and he's like, okay, you get to keep your gift, but no one's ever going to believe you. And
this is like the ancient Greek equivalent of like, hey, beautiful, how's your day? When you meet someone on a dating app and you're like, hey, thanks, but I don't really think it's going to work out.
And then they send you a dick pic.
Slut anyways.
Yeah.
Thanks, Apollo.
Thanks, Apollo, for that. So she goes about her life and she foresees everything that's going to happen, right? She sees the war. She sees what happens with Helen. She sees the fall and the death of her brothers, the enslavement of her mother, all of these things. And of course, it eventually drives her crazy. And this professor tells Elizabeth Lesser that we kind of have inherited that the world is still that way, that women still seek to be listened to and to be believed, and we aren't. And that's that whole mad woman concept too, right? Where we have and I think honestly, I always talk about how I really can't stand Gothic. I'm sorry, Randall, please don't like unfriend me on everything. But I think it's that reason. I think I'm really triggered by that unbelieved first wife stuck in the attic somewhere where everyone thinks she's a ghost. It just really bothers me. And maybe I'll approach Gothic a little bit differently now that I figured that out. But
well, not all Gothic is Jane Eyre.
This is true. That was my intro. So
that's fair.
And it's most people's intro. So
yeah.
Fair enough.
So that's the story of Cassandra. And as she goes through the book, she looks at 3 specific women who are popular in mythologies and cultural reasons, for religious reasons, or just being infamous and having stories told, and stories told upon stories and made up stories. And then the idea of the the Jewish midrash, right, which emphasizes the stories and explains things that make up for the inequalities in the stories or the missing pieces. And the three women that she speaks of mostly, first is Eve, second is Pandora, and the third is Cassandra herself. So this week we're focusing on Eve and what her story is, and how her story was told. I think it's really important to talk about, and maybe one of you want to do it instead of me, talk about the lens of how we come across these stories and who tells them. Randall, you're going to sing, I know it. You want to take it, or do you want me to do it?
I'm muted. You missed my Hamilton.
I missed it. You did that on purpose. You did that on purpose.
I've got to skirt those copyright censors.
Yeah, that's true. Well,
who lives, who dies, who tells your story?
There you go. I think you're under the limit for the copyright. You're good. You have a certain amount of words.
Fair use.
Yep. You want to talk about that?
I mean, I could talk about it a little bit. I think it's a really interesting thought process, and this is something that has kind of come to the forefront of our national conversation when we're talking about things like critical race theory. Like, a lot of times when we are educated in our American system, we don't realize that we're not just learning the true version of events as they happen, right? We tend to approach history as like this set of facts that is put in this textbook and delivered to us in a nice, neat little package. But that's the beauty of studying culture through a mythological lens instead of a historical lens, is that mythology is like a game of telephone. And we know that these stories, because we have so many different versions of them, change depending on who's telling the story, who their audience is, and what the cultural context currently is at the time, or, the zeitgeist is. And I think it's so important that we really use a critical eye when we come to any story, whether it's religious or secular or historical or whatever it is, and consider who is telling the story and what is their goal by communicating the story, right? People don't just tell people do tell stories for fun. That's one of the goals. But when it comes to history, these stories are usually told for a specific reason, right? To inspire some like pride in the nation, to give a history for, I'm sorry, there's like a car alarm going on outside and it is like totally distracting me. Can y'all hear that?
No.
I just hope it's not my car. Oh, it's off now. Okay. And so we have to think the purpose of telling the story. Is it just for fun or entertainment value, or is it for, like I was saying, like inspiring national pride, or a way to explain how things came to be the way they are, a way to justify or excuse specific behavior, right? And we hear a lot of this rhetoric in the news about how like traditional way of doing things, or a traditional lifestyle, or traditional values. And so we tend to put a lot of value into doing things the way they've always been done, and not wanting to turn around and bring a critical view to that. And I think that the story of Eve, like, this is like the foundational myth for, excuse this shit term, of Judeo-Christian society, right? This is the foundational myth of Abrahamic religions, the foundational story, if the word myth makes you feel uncomfortable. And this story, it does so much for us. It tells us what our gender roles are. It explains why childbirth is painful. It explains maybe a little bit why men have a more pronounced Adam's apple than we do. It explains why it explains why snakes slither on their bellies. It explains why there's suffering and sadness and death and disease in the world. And it teaches us that we are fallible as humans. And that's just like a little sprinkling off the top of my head of what this story teaches us. And even if people aren't necessarily religious or brought up in the Christian tradition or the Jewish tradition or the Islamic tradition, this story is still a foundational part of our culture, because our founding fathers, they were Christian. And this is a foundational narrative for our secular American culture today. And I'm going to step off my soapbox now. I feel like that was really long-winded.
I want to add that it also teaches us that God is singular and that God is a man and that God is infallible. These are three concepts that were relatively new at the time these tales were told. And then once we get into Eve a little bit, we can talk about the mother of everything, right? And how at once that was a goddess, and then she's relegated to the human form, right? As the second created.
Well, and I want to, that's a good segue here, because I think our idea of what has been around forever is always skewed by our own lifetimes and the lifetimes of our parents, because obviously not many people know how many times the flag salute has changed. For example, they tend to think, well, this is the way it's always been done. Well, it's always been done that way only in your lifetime. And you're now that, like, you know, your parents have raised you in this lifetime, they may not even realize that, like, it was they forgot it changed in their lifetime. So our cultural memory is very, very short, which again is that critical race theory angle, because the reality is that, you know, we did have operating slave homes and things like that. I think the one that we went to, Randall, in New Orleans, one of those houses was shut down in 1974. I was born in 1973. So again, our cultural memory is so very short, and what we think we remember beyond that isn't accurate whatsoever, kind of a Fahrenheit kind of thing. So as this is a founding story, but even when it looks like, even how it was taken, even how we believed it, what it really meant, or like Deb, if we go far enough back, right? It has changed. Like you said, mythology changes based on what that culture needs and what their goals are for the story. So we have the story mutate in a way that, say, even if we leave goddess tradition out of the early Eve stories, if we stay purely early Jewish stories, there isn't a sense that necessarily it was a sin, but other than, as we looked at Cassandra Speak, that there's a growing up period. That Eden was never a place you could stay in. Eden was always a childlike state that you were then leaving. And so it changes over time, and it's generally about power and about, as you said, introducing that male god, a subservient female that makes a mistake, and now there's an excuse or reason to take power over her and pour some sort of legal limitations on her and her intellect.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's been, if we look at Tertullian, like we were talking about earlier, there's been an agenda that's also attached to the story.
Yes.
For a long time.
I think it's important to recognize too that, especially through the Renaissance, when we get all these paintings,
right,
the famous Michelangelo, it's European centric as well. So these people are coming across as white,
yes,
and you know, and so they've been literally whitewashed. They've been painted over, right? So a lot of the cultural stuff is reappropriated, and those Western European ideals were pushed onto those stories. And that's what we're seeing today most of the time.
Yes.
So, can I tell the Sumerian story?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can I really quick, while we're still on this, I wanted to point out on page 21 of the book, Cassandra Speaks, I really love how Elizabeth Lesser says, you may think these stories are the stuff of once upon a time and have nothing to do with you or your times. But once upon a time is now, because the past is laced into the present on the needle and thread of stories.
Yeah, I love that line too.
Oh my gosh, like I might cross stitch that to hang in my living room. It's incredible, and I just wanted to point that specific passage out before we move on.
Yeah, I love that.
Do you have a date on your Sumerian? I mean, I know approximately, but do you have a?
I don't. What I found was it's from the biblicalheritagecenter.org. and it's talking about Eve's Judaic name, Hawa. I'm not sure, like I know something like it's Chava. I'm not sure how to properly pronounce it, and I apologize for that. But this organization says that Eve was mistakenly called, or Eve by mistake, because the Hebrew name Hawa links this name with the prime verbal root to make live. And that's where the connection to the Sumerian story comes in. Adam named his wife Hawa because she was the mother of all the living, which is in Genesis 3, I think, verse 20. But the Sumerian mistress of the mountain, Ninhursag, was a goddess, and she was married to Enki, right? And Enki, we now identify with Yahweh. There's a lot of, down the line, you can see the evolutions. He was cursed by his wife because he had eaten her forbidden plants in her paradise, her garden paradise. She grew this.
Is this a nice way of talking about oral sex?
It can be. That's a whole theory.
He ate her forbidden plants in her special garden.
Well, but also, if you want to go there, we could talk about the naming of things as rape, because women aren't allowed to name things. And that's a whole academic theory as well. So yeah, I mean, there's this. We could definitely sexualize these stories, absolutely. But in this case, let's start with the literal version of it before we get there.
They can't have birth without sex, so they're inherently sexual stories.
Well, sure, yeah. But I don't know why she would curse him for doing that. Anyway, maybe it was bad.
Maybe he wasn't good at it.
I need to be drinking something different.
Yeah, this is why I have this. How you doing? Okay.
I did not bring it. I'm momming it today. I came straight here from Raging Waters with my son.
Wow.
Perfect.
That's great.
Academic mom.
Raging Waters.
Okay.
You know what? I was not going to go there, Randall.
I gotta switch hats now.
Okay. Yeah. So let me tell my story. Okay. More sex talk.
Okay. Sumerian mythology.
Oh my God! All of my students just left my classes.
Ancient Mesopotamia.
Okay. Yes. And Ninhursag is in her paradise garden, and she's like, okay, nobody touch my lettuce. Nobody touch my plants. Well, he goes in there and he eats 8 of them. And so she gets pissed.
8 lettuces?
8 lettuces. It's like 8 weeds. And so she gets mad and she curses him. She's like, dude, you're going to die now. This is rude. I told you not to, and you did. And everyone was like, no, you don't curse him. Like, he's your husband. You should love him, whatever. And she's like, fine. And so she goes to him and she says, my brother husband, because that's a thing in God world, what hurts you? And he says, my rib hurts me. And so she creates the goddess Ninti, which is Lady of the Rib. And she says, I've given birth for you. Now, the word for rib in Sumerian is ti, Ninti, Ti, which happens to also be the Sumerian verb to make live. And if you notice, Adam named his wife Hawa, the mother of all the living. And so there's a link there between Ninti and Hawa. So the Mesopotamian author, whoever came up with the story or wrote the story down for us, kind of made a pun. They equated Lady of the Rib, Ninti, with Lady who makes live. Ninti, she is the goddess who brings Enti back to life. And of course, as those stories go through time and they're told orally, and then other people write them down, and as they're going down through time, they're changed, just like the way we talked about with the Eurocentric invasion on these stories in the Renaissance. And Eve becomes the woman who is created from Adam's rib, and therefore her ability to give life, the mother of all, and it's coming from the rib, which is that Sumerian pun.
Right.
So I just love that.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, there's very, very strong textual evidence to suggest that the stories in the Hebrew Bible are have roots in ancient Mesopotamian mythology. There's also the kind of the blueprint to the biblical story of Noah and the flood. You could find in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the first writing of the Hebrew Bible by a really long time. It's considered like our first piece of literature ever as humans. And so it stands to reason that in this geographic location, right? Because if we think the Middle East, where the Hebrew Bible was written down, and ancient Mesopotamia, like they're right there. If I was in a classroom, I'd pull down the map and show you, but you'll have to take my word for it. It's really close together. And so it stands to reason that people, especially who might be more nomadic people, are traveling this area, interacting with people that they come across and exchanging stories and getting to know each other and sharing their culture just like we do today. And these stories they change hands and they get tweaked a little bit in meaning, like we talked about earlier, depending on who's telling the story and why they're telling it. And so all these stories are morphing and changing a little bit based on the different cultures that are telling them. And then of course we have all sorts of translation errors and a bunch of ridiculous stuff. And with a story this old, like Kiese was talking about, we have such a short cultural memory. I mean, there's even a mistranslation in Cinderella, and that story, or the mistranslation, happened only a few hundred years ago, and that's all we know now. Right? In the original, she had fur slippers, not glass slippers.
In the original, it was fish bones. It was a Chinese tale.
In the original.
We don't know. There's no original.
The oldest.
As the folklorist in the group, I'm gonna call it.
Okay. Kiese gets this one. She gets the point.
In the source text that was translated, there was a translation error.
Because what I was going to say is that I had forgotten that part of the Sumerian story, because that is the beginning, as we all know, of Rapunzel. Is the
as we all
know,
the
Rapunzel, the climbing over the fence, the eating the lettuce, right? And then there has to be some sort of consequence to that, and the consequence in Rapunzel is to take the child. Kind of thing. So as you do.
But honestly, that's biblical too. If we're talking about Eden as childhood, taking the child out of that, I mean, that's sort of a biblical thing too.
Well, what's interesting about Rapunzel is they trap her, though.
Yeah,
so
they do.
There's this interesting conversation, and I don't mean though as in not aligning, but a flipping of the narrative. So what's the goal of you left one garden, one walled area, to then end up in another one that's even worse? So where does that go? That's an interesting layering.
That'd be a good paper.
That would be a great paper.
Yeah.
One of you write it.
So I'll put it on my list.
Oh yeah, I have a lot of spare time right now.
Yeah, I'll put it on my list.
I'm busy.
Got 2 books due. Yeah, it's all good. I also wanted to talk about the whole childhood idea of the Garden of Eden as the first part of the maturation cycle, right? In psychology, we call it individuation. Elizabeth talks about that in her book a little bit, psychological terms, but she also pulls in Campbell's hero's journey, and you know that I have to as well, because I think I'm required by law at this point.
Agreed.
Yeah. And I really love how she speaks to the idea that the men in these biblical stories are going through these heroes' journeys, and they go through the fall, and they're allowed to resurrect. They're allowed to come back and say, okay, I screwed up. Here's my atonement, and I'm going to individuate. I'm going to become a better person now. Eve is not allowed that chance. She falls, and that's it. Her story ends. And that's what I really sit here. It's what keeps me awake sometimes, and I'm thinking in my nerd self way of keeping myself up at night.
That's what keeps me up at night. Freaking Eve.
Yeah,
I get it. I love it.
It's sad.
How do you know you're talking to nerds?
Yeah. Okay. I'm just sitting here going, Eve, why was your story stopped? But you know, what if it wasn't? What if she was allowed to repent and do the things that the men were allowed to do? And why wasn't she? And moreover, why is her story more popular than the first creation story in the same book, Genesis, that is often attributed to Lilith through the Midrash, and now, of course, just common tradition because she's spoken about so much. But why? Why is Eve more popular?
Well, I would like to jump in there a little bit and say that I can offer you two alternates. One is, in a sense, in the Bible, she doesn't end with the fall any more than, say, Adam does. They're both punished. The serpent is punished, and everybody moves on and has a new generation.
But she is cursed with the fault of it, and it's only because she made Adam, so it's not his fault.
Sort of, because again, I'm going to do a Miltonic reading of it, and Milton actually flips the narrative, and he's doing it with a lot of 800 pages worth of De Doctrina in Latin and Greek and whatever, with hundreds of Bible verses, where he's using again the Jewish and some of the Jewish midrash pieces and stuff like that. And so he's trying to not create something new and flip the narrative on purpose in his own way, but to like read into it, lean into knowing that stories change, and knowing that that there's a power struggle happening here about how we choose to interpret the story. And so Milton, and I have it in my paper, of course, the exact number, but essentially it takes Eve over 300 lines of epic poetry. And actually for the whole epic, it takes 8 books and 791 lines to get her to eat the apple. When we know that that is the ultimate point of the story, right? It's Paradise Lost. And so for all of these epic verses, it takes forever. Now, what's interesting is he says her rash hand, that she pulls the apple, this is rash. But Milton has a way of using words like that to kind of point out their opposite, that he uses that word because people accuse her of being rash. And it's rash only in the sense that it happened at all. But it's not rash clearly in the span of this telling. That again, it takes 8 books of epic story and another almost 800 lines to get her before she eats the apple. On the other hand, it takes Adam less than 50. He decides the moment he sees her, but it takes him less than 50. And he is not seduced in any way in Milton's telling. There's no question. There's very clear that the serpent, and I guess I'll back up a little bit. The serpent goes, oh, this is going to be easy. I'll go track her down. I'll go find her. I'll seduce her. I'll pretend like I love her. But the lines are very clear that he actually does love her, that Satan does fall in love with her because she is the queen of Eden. She is the breath of God. She is everything. And so he's desperately in love with her. And so he's going to fake being in love with her in order to convince her to eat the apple, which is the lie to himself. Interestingly enough, he almost never lies to her. And so he comes up to her.
Is this like the plot of Bridgerton?
Yes.
Yes.
Hey, Milton
That's all I'm
influenced
hearing
all.
right now.
This is why I have this. This is why I have the Milton is better than Shakespeare t-shirt. Okay. Milton is the point of every story. Okay. Anyway.
All roads lead to Milton.
All roads
Who
lead
knew?
to Milton. So anyway, like obviously I have 200 pages on this, so I'm jumping ahead probably, and I shouldn't, but I'm trying to condense. But he chases her down, and she's all alone, right, picking her fruit. And he starts going, oh my gosh, you're beautiful. You're the queen of heaven. I had to talk to you. I finally got my voice, and I just wanted to be desperately near you. And she goes, what the hell? Why are you talking? She completely ignores everything he just said. And then he's like, oh, I've got a story for you. And he spends another 100 lines like explaining this story about how he found this tree, and then he ate it, and then he could talk, and then he wanted to talk to her, and she should eat too. And she's like, I do not believe you. And she goes, you better show me. And so it's interesting because they go back and forth for over 200 lines of her being absolutely logical, which is really interesting that he kind of flips this gender stereotype that Eve is questioning everything. There isn't a place at which she even is really seduced. It's a relationship decision for Milton, because it's not, she should have, if she's going to change her state of being, not talk to her husband as Lord, but as partner. And she makes this change in her whole being without having a discussion about it. When Adam has been waiting for her this whole time, because she convinced him we should divide up and we should go work separately so we'll get more work done in the garden. And they have this great man-woman conversation where he's like, no, I want to protect you. And she's like, do you think I'm weak? And he's like, no, but I wouldn't want you to be insulted by this bad guy who's coming after you. And she's like, what? Does my butt look big? It's this whole hysterical conversation. So anyway, she wins. And so he's been waiting for her this whole time, weaving cute little flower garlands for her hair, just totally waiting for her to get back. And then he has a bad feeling because, of course, Eden starts dying the moment she tastes the apple. And so when she walks up, she's dying. Her face is flushed. She looks feverish. The flowers that he's weaving are falling. The petals are falling out and wilting and falling to the ground. I keep waiting for someone to make a movie of this because it's so great. It's just a total Lord of the Rings. I know that's not your thing, Randall, but a total Lord of the Rings moment where like every step she takes, the grass just wilts and dies around her and spreads out. Because here was Queen of Eden. When she walked by, the roses turned to her and bloomed more. And now that she's eaten this fruit and broken this relationship with everyone, now it's dying and falling apart. And so his petals are dropping off, and she's like, Adam, we were lied to. This is great. You should try it. And he's very aware. His first things are, oh my God, who killed you? I am heartbroken that you are dying right now. And they didn't just kill you, they killed me too. Because I'm going to die with you. There's no seduction, there's no anything, it's very clear for Milton that every individual in the story had to make their own choice. And again, this is a man who wrote a lot of legal things for churches, for laws. We base our freedom of speech amendments off Milton and his writings. So what's interesting is, again, this is a story that ultimately we interpret based on how we want to treat women and power issues. And so it's interesting to see someone so important of his caliber changing that narrative. I'm not going to argue that he's feminist at all, but that he's changing that narrative, right? And for him is also very legalistic ways and making very big points about if God can forgive this isn't the end of her narrative, that she made a mistake and that even Satan can repent in Paradise Lost. And so if even Satan can repent in Paradise Lost, you have no right to speak to a woman this way. And it's very interesting because Paradise Lost, the biggest witch burning years are 1550 to 1650. And he publishes Paradise in 1667. So there's almost this direct moment where he's talking back to the church fathers, and he's talking back to the legal people, and he's talking back to the witch trials. And in the end of Paradise, Eve has the dream, and talk about woman's intuition and everything. She has the dream that it's going to be okay. And the angels tell Satan, you need to listen to her. Tell Adam, you need to listen to her. She knows what she's talking about. You need to make it up. And they walk out together equally. And so it's very interesting because, again, he's leaning into, he's not trying to just reframe and create something new or rewrite history in any way. He's backing it on all of this knowledge, of all of this study, of all of everything that's going on. And he's trying to course correct where he thinks thoughts have gone wrong, where he thinks things have been added to the tradition.
But he's doing that through his cultural perspective as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Can we talk about the serpent?
Let's.
And what the symbolism is of the serpent? Somebody want to start?
Yeah, I want to give a little like disclaimer before we talk about this, and a reminder about how, like, a little definition of what a symbol is, right? A symbol is anything that it's non-literal meaning. And so symbols are completely different across cultures. And so we have to think a lot of the things that we see or we interpret as symbols today may not have had the same meaning or impact at the time that the text was written.
Well, in biblical times, the serpent symbolized wisdom, right? And what that means, how the people in biblical times would define the word wisdom, I think is up for debate. I mean, in any sort of connotative way, right? However you debate. So when I say that it symbolizes wisdom, I'm looking at wisdom from how I understand the word through my cultural perspective. And so if it's interesting, Elizabeth Lesser says that Eve is the first grown-up. She's the first one to realize that they have to grow up. They have to leave this childlike state. And I find that to be true in almost every relationship that I've had with a man. I've always had to be the one that kind of says, no, we need to buy a house, or yeah, maybe it's time we start thinking about having kids, or maybe we should do this, or maybe, and then it's always like, no. And then once it's done, it's like, they're the greatest inventor of all time. Right. And they're like, look what I have achieved. I have made fire, right? To quote Tom Hanks. And you're just over there like, good job. I'm going to be over here with Cassandra. We're going to be talking about you. But the idea is that it's the serpent is wisdom, and giving Eve this idea that they can't stay in this childlike state. They have to grow up. They have to move on, and they have to experience, because in Eden itself, there is no experience. You're existing. Everything is perfect. There is no tension. There's no anything. And in order to live, in order to experience something, there has to be tension. In today's really divided culture, we call any sort of tension trauma. And I think the word trauma honestly needs to be addressed as far as how we perceive that. Trauma needs to happen. I don't mean that all trauma that we have experienced needs to happen, because abuse, etc. I mean, that's an entirely different conversation. But the idea that there needs to be the tension, that's where all of everything is created, right? And so the idea that the serpent is giving Eve this advice, or tricking her, if you will, depending on how you're looking at it, I think that's worth talking about. And then also talking about, and I think Kiese, you can probably do this better than me, and maybe Randall too, how the serpent is associated with the goddess in times before this.
That's one of my favorite things. So archetypally, if we obviously look at serpent, and yes, of course, it's different in different cultures, but we have so much evidence, across continents of obviously the serpent, whether we're talking about Mayan, or whether we're talking about indigenous peoples in America, or whether we're talking about Africa, or we're talking about Europe, that we have so many examples, of course. Again, to use the easy white one, that the serpent is healing, that it's this gateway between life and death, that we have this coiled serpent that represents creation, or the moon changing, and that the serpent gives, of course,
the sixth chakra.
yes, the serpent gives birth to itself, and leaves its skin behind and becomes something new. And so we have so many examples of it, meaning the calendar and again being associated with women and fertility. And so we have this beautiful story. If we go that direction, we have this incredibly beautiful story about this woman, in a sense, this first woman, this not mothered yet woman coming to the fruit tree, right? And of course, the fruit tree being, of course, wisdom as well, and life and death and knowledge of everything. And good and evil, yes, but also just knowledge of the world, right? And so I actually was doing a study on the fruit and doing Persephone, but again, we're not really talking about an apple in any of these stories. And so one of the fruits that comes up a lot is, like, say, the pomegranate. And what's really interesting is that the pomegranate sliced open, and I had some pictures, which you probably don't want to see, but there are lots of native traditions of, again, and tell me when it gets to a TMI, but again, of offering.
I think we've surpassed that. We're good. Once we went to the lettuce and
offering the afterbirth. Are you sure? I'm
sure.
Offering the afterbirth, right, to the gods. That we have the baby. If you lay out the afterbirth and you look at it, the reality is it's very seedy. It looks like the inside of a pomegranate. It looks like a tree. And then here it is, of course, attached this child. And then this cord that has to be cut. So this child is kind of freed from this root system. And so there's these beautiful pictures of these indigenous stories and indigenous peoples laying this fruit in it as the afterbirth at the tree and replanting it. And so we have this really beautiful story of this woman coming to the tree, of fertility, of knowledge, of the universe, of time starting. And of course, the snake, if the snake is going to come down from the heavens, right, that gateway between life and death, that gateway of time beginning, and is going to come down to the woman, because the woman is the mother, or will be the mother of everything. What would he have to say to, or the non-gendered serpent have to say to the man? Because the man doesn't have that possibility in him. And so the serpent comes and speaks to the woman and coaches her, teaches her, this is the consuming of the seed. This is the giving of the creating of the fruit. This is the bearing of the fruit and the creating of time itself. It's just such a beautiful story when we take off, if you take off kind of the lens or the framework of, then the Father God says this is no. If you just stick to the heart of it, my little snake. I think.
So do we feel like Eve had to consume the fruit in order to produce the fruit?
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how the story naturally goes. That it's almost, again, like creation itself, right? The heavens come down and bestow her with the knowledge to consume the seed, to consume the fruit, to give birth to the new generation, and to, in a sense, start time. Because in Genesis, right, in Eden, there is no time. Like you said, there's no trauma, there's no moving forward, there's no, it is all, in fact, Milton says it's time is stopped in Eden. It's always bearing fruit. Nothing is happening. Nothing's changing. Nothing's aging, because there's no mortality yet. So in a sense, in giving birth, you introduce mortality, which then we look at a lot of ancient cultures. And again, easiest with Greece is to look at the reality that when we introduce birth and death, that then life has meaning in a way it doesn't have for the gods.
I'd like to build on that a little bit with the chakras, where we were talking about the snake and the coil. The lower chakras are tied to animalistic necessities of life, right? We are going to the bathroom, or having sex and procreating. and eating and consuming, right? All of these things take place in our digestive system, and it's just every animal does those things, right? To keep alive, to create more of our type or whatever. And but the mid, when we start to get to the heart chakra, that's sort of where the ribs are, right? And that's also where Buddha was born. He was born from his mother's side. And we can talk about this virgin birth idea of being born from that animalistic tendency to the more idealistic or ideology of the spiritual realm. And Adam and Eve can represent that as well. And if Eve is the birth of that spiritual realm, of her giving us access to love and compassion and all these feminine things, I just find it, kudos to the people who were able to subjugate that and say that that was lesser than the animalistic tendencies of your average dog on the corner. Like, good job. How did you do that?
Yeah.
Wow.
They just frame it.
They just framed it, and then they just enclosed it. It's like when we first moved into our house, I was wondering why our plants weren't getting any bigger. So we did some investigating, and our neighbor, or the people who lived here before us, planted everything within the planter. And the roots weren't allowed to grow. They weren't allowed to spread, so they stayed the same size. And I just thought, wow, if that is not a lesson. I was just like, well, damn.
Like a goldfish, right? We only grow as big as our container.
Yeah, even fish. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So
and
there
so
you
if
go.
the patriarchy and our religion and our stories are building this container for us that we don't even know exists, how are we going to grow larger than that?
It's the bad bitch syndrome. That's my new coined term. It's probably going to piss a lot of people off. But it's that the women living, like my mom, especially, like I watched her in her second wave feminism, and she hated the patriarchy. And every time we'd pass a woman on the roadside who's doing Caltrans work or something, she'd be like, yeah, you go. And, you know, I hate this, and I'm going to do what I want and say what I want because I'm a woman and I have a brain. But she was still arguing all of that within the confines of the patriarchy. She couldn't not acknowledge her prison, her planter, right? She couldn't break free of that. And because if you really are that bad bitch, you don't have to acknowledge all that. You're beyond it. So
I will say it is a lesson with my daughter, who's, you know, now 15, how much she catches me in my container.
Yeah.
Because she's grown up with me, right? And she's her own person, and she's so smart on her own. And so she'll catch me and she'll be like, Mom, you just gendered that. Or and it's interesting because she's grown up just in a different culture where some of this, you know, it's very, we've created, I guess, in a sense, a new container for her to I'm grateful for her to swim in.
Much bigger.
Right? And so I have to go, honey, okay, I'm sorry. Thank you for correcting me. But could you just
be nice?
Just acknowledge that Mommy helped make that container for you.
Yeah.
I'm not perfect, but I outgrew my container and I'm offering you a bigger one. And so
yeah. Oh yeah, I catch myself all the time. It's ridiculous. I was so excited. I'm listening to John Green's new book. And he rates things, ironically, it's great, but he's talking about air conditioning. And then he went on this whole rant about how room temperature is actually a sexist ideal, because guess who decided what room temperature was? Men in suits. Right. And so women go into these office buildings and then we're wearing dresses or whatever, and we're freezing. Yeah. And they're like, oh, you're just too sensitive. You need to like figure it out. And like, oh, you don't belong here
because y'all are wearing undershirts and long sleeve shirts and suit jackets and a freaking tie up
and maybe a vest
and maybe a vest, right?
Yeah. And we're over here in like,
socks.
And so no wonder we need sweaters, etc. And so I ran, of course, to my son, right? He's the only one in my family who'll let me like preach about this stuff every now and then. I'm like, did you know that room temperature is sexist? He's like, where have you been? Like, that's a whole platform.
Well, see, that's it.
Rude. Like, no, I did not know. I was coming to you with this exciting news, and it's very rude that you already knew this and did not share.
Exactly. My daughter's like, hello, that's a meme on Pinterest.
Oh, just wait, Randall. I can't wait until Sadie is 15.
She's gonna learn you.
Yeah.
She already does. Like
Some new things.
she's too smart for me at 2.5. I don't know what the future is going to hold for that one. If only
it'll
I
be
was
great.
Cassandra.
We can quote Hamilton and say, "Just you wait." We started with Hamilton. We can end with Hamilton.
Wait, we can't end yet.
No.
I have a couple of more plugs for Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. So much stuff has come up in this conversation that he addresses in Ishmael. And one thing he does is he offers an alternative explanation for the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis, and says that it wasn't written by the people who now believe this story, but it was written by outsiders looking in at the agricultural revolution and seeing and telling the story about the birth of agriculture and how the agriculture itself was the curse of mankind. Because instead of just living off the land and foraging and hunting and gathering and living a nomadic lifestyle, they believed that agriculture is work. And Daniel Quinn poses the question, like, in this foundational story of our culture that prizes agriculture, why is it seen as a punishment for Adam? And he argues that it's because it was written by the nomadic peoples watching this happen and saying there must be something wrong with these people over here to have been punished or cursed in such a way. And that eventually the story got picked up and reframed and changed, but not quite changed enough because it's still confusing. Yeah. Why would that be a curse to us? And then anthropologically speaking, if we're looking at this story, we could think that eating the forbidden fruit kind of is an implication of like when we developed bipedalism a little bit, like, and because of the way that our bodies changed and evolved over time, like birth became something that was difficult and like a curse. And some people think it's because our heads are too big because they're so full of knowledge, right? That humans are pretty isolated among species for having like painful, difficult births. So of course we would tell our stories to explain like why is it so difficult for us and it's so easy for, like, have y'all seen a giraffe give birth? They're just walking along and the baby just falls right out of them, and like the baby stands up and like everybody's good, and that's it.
I think the issue is not so much with the problem that it is difficult. I think the issue is that women are they're still seen as weak and not as capable, even though we're literally creating another human
person.
Yeah, birth is the hardest thing I've ever done in my whole life ever. And I think the hardest thing I will ever do. It literally felt like my body was breaking in half as I was in labor. And I felt so like primal because my thought was, will somebody just hit me over the head with a freaking rock and like take care of this for me? Mm-hmm. Right? Like, and I literally thought with a rock, like I was like calling back to my ancestors, like in a cave going through this by myself in the dark. And it was, I mean, I was in the dark. I wouldn't let anybody turn on any lights while I was in labor. But it was really humbling. Like that's how all of us have to come into this world. We have to nearly destroy one container, right, to get into our other cultural container. And it's a really overwhelming thought. Like, how is humanity still happening when it's that dramatic to enter this world?
Or you have cramps. Oh. And then, you get these period simulators and the guy's like, you put it on a 2 and the girl's like tries it. She's like at a 12 and she's like, yeah, I could still go for a jog. And the guy's rolling around on the floor on a 2, but women are weak, right? And my mom used to always say that too. Like she'd be like, thanks, Eve, for like your story and like how birth is traumatic and it's splitting open these containers. And I used to be like, yeah, thanks, Eve. And I just really, really feel like I owe her an apology at this point. Eve. probably my mom too, but yeah.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating. And I'm going to bring it back to Daniel Quinn.
Yep.
He talks about the forbidden fruit as not necessarily knowledge of how to be a human, but as the knowledge, as believing that humans have the knowledge of the gods. So he says that he argues that this could be a criticism of the surrounding peoples that were watching the development of agriculture, saying that these people think that they know what the gods know. They think they know who should live and who should die. They think they have that knowledge, but they don't actually, because they're still human and they're still fallible and mortal just like the rest of us, but they're acting as if that is true.
And that is
I think that's
that's Milton's fruit as well. There's no the way that he illustrates knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge is really interesting, because the fruit itself has no knowledge. Fruit is very clearly a drug. And so Eve takes it, and she, in fact, I always tease my students that she's sitting there by the tree, like she takes a bite and she's like, I love you, tree. Like, I should have done this a long time ago. And she has this great
what a good trip, Adam. You gotta try this shit.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And they both get high. They're totally intoxicated. In fact, intoxicated is the words he used. And then they have sex, monster, lusty, crazy sex. Now, I will say that they had already had sex in Milton's. It wasn't a knowledge of sex itself. And it was a changing of how they view one another. And this assumption of knowledge, this assumption of power, this assumption that I can take what I want. And so their relationship changes with those assumptions that they know what the gods know, and that they have a different kind of autonomy even from each other. So they look at each other with lust for the first time rather than with communion. Sex becomes something to take rather than something to share. And that is it's very interesting with the apple, because there's a very long conversation that they both have as they get completely hammered on this fruit. And it's very much like all your drunk friends who think they're smarter now, having really big conversations. I love you, man. You got it.
For that person that does acid one time and now they like all the secrets of the universe have been revealed to them.
And all the lyrics.
And I'm wondering too, the lyrics of Pink Floyd?
Yes.
Oh, you can't see all my Pink Floyd records behind me. So they're down there though. Oh, which way? This way.
Oh, they're there.
So, okay, but I'm thinking about DMT now, obviously, because this has turned into the Joe Rogan podcast.
Obviously.
And I'm thinking that you can extract DMT from the acacia tree, and the acacia tree is so often seen as the world tree. And of course, if we're going into like Vampire Diaries mythology, like they have the white acacia. Anyways, I won't go into all of that. And Lilith, as the mother of the vampires, just know that those things exist. And if you want to engage in discourse with me,
I can bring in Buffy,
leave a comment and we can do all sorts of vampire things, including Lilith in True Blood. But
I'm
wondering, but wait, does the acacia tree flower? Does the acacia tree produce fruit? I don't know. I don't think so, but I'm open to anybody who might know that. Because this is such an interesting interpretation. Like they're taking the product, the fruit of the tree, and I've never thought of this story from a hallucinogenic perspective before.
They do flower.
Interesting.
So we can, with the stories, again, going on the folklore side, with the stories of consuming something in some kind of communal or breaking the law kind of thing that we have with an Adam and Eve. Again, we have it with Rapunzel. We also have with Beauty and the Beast, at which point it's a flower, right? So with Persephone, I was going to bring that up earlier. That's how I ended up writing that Persephone Demeter story. I had an emergency C-section, and so I was doing mythology on the earth being torn open, and it's a flower that Persephone picks first at which point Demeter, her mother, right, the earth is torn open to steal Persephone through and bring her to the underworld. And we have this kind of death resurrection moment, this leaving of the garden, right? And so Persephone is also very much aligned with this kind of story. And we start out with the flower rather than the fruit. And then later it becomes the fruit in the underworld. But it starts with the flower first. And so we have a lot of stories like the Corn Mother, things like that, where it is a different, right, item. And very often it is a drug-inducing item, because that wasn't uncommon. I mean, that's lots of societies use that for enlightenment.
Yeah. Hallucinogens
kind of
have been a religious tool for the entirety of human history as a way to communicate with the spirit world, or to receive guidance from, or to test your test your faith, test your limits, test your knowledge. And I think it's worth
Even
noting at this point too. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's worth noting too that we haven't really clarified that it wasn't necessarily an apple. And I know, Kiese, you briefly mentioned that, but this is another part of like anglicizing or whitewashing the story. Apple trees are not native to the Middle East. Adam and Eve, the people writing down these stories, the people telling these stories, would never have seen an apple tree most likely in their lives. And we think it's an apple tree because we get these translations. And I believe even the King James version and these translations of the Bible, they still just say forbidden fruit, but it's like, is it Milton that made it an apple?
Apple was a common word for fruit, all kinds of fruit, except for berries. And so apple, it could have been anything. So there was.
So I think the biggest contenders are that it was probably either a fig or a pomegranate.
A fig or a pomegranate are the largest contenders for this particular version, this particular story. Again, as you walk around the world and tell similar stories, it's going to change into whatever is native to that region.
Sure.
And that's the big problem.
Just like McDonald's, bringing it back.
I do have to say that in some ways, our translations are the best that they can be, because as Deb pointed out, sometimes it's not necessarily, it's hard. I don't want to use the word mistranslation again, but when they didn't have the kind of language or classification that we have. And so we talk about an old story like this, and then even when they translate it into apple, they understood the term apple to mean something that then we bring to it now. And so it's not even necessarily a bad translation to use the term apple. It's just that when we bring our current lens to it, then suddenly it goes astray, because it did mean something different, which is also, we have a lot of problems with, say, the plagues of Egypt, because they didn't have terms that we have now. When we talk about locusts, well, what does that mean? That means eating, flying bug of some kind. But what does that mean exactly? And so we have these problems throughout all of these pieces, because we keep trying to nail down these specifics in a sense and classify them with our scientific, supposed rational mind. And I'm going to say supposed, because the reality is that, we're talking about cultures that were highly specialized and highly intelligent. And to say that we're somehow better or whatever, is different. They have a different language system that obviously clearly worked for them. And we're kind of self-imposing.
Well, and these stories, once they were written down, this is a Campbell idea. They get stuck. They're frozen, and there's no evolution, right? Whereas when these stories were told orally through generations, they naturally developed those cultural implications and cultural references that people would automatically understand. Whereas today, we get this one story and we have to go back however many hundreds or 1,000 years or whatever and try to figure it out. And if you think, even during Shakespeare's time, like, I know you're not a huge fan, but their vocabulary was huge compared to ours. Like, we don't have even nearly the same amount of words. And so their ability to connote something comes to come from words that we don't even have a clue about. So,
And the way that you just described that, Deb, it makes me think of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, where you have
It does.
Of course
For
it
me, it
does.
always comes back to
All
Milton. For
roads lead
Randall,
to
it always comes
Rocky.
back to Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But this is an incredible example, right? It's a cultural phenomenon. I don't have to do a whole thing. Again, if anyone's interested in a Rocky
She's
Horror
begging,
discussion,
please.
please let us know. I am so excited to put that together for you because it does have mythological roots. What? We could totally talk about that.
And you already did a presentation on it.
And I've done a presentation on it.
Oh yeah.
But in this specific instance, with static mythology versus like the amorphous, like constantly changing oral mythology, we have this in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It went from a theatrical stage show to a movie. The movie is a static version, a snapshot of that moment in time.
Yes.
But now it's performed on stages with the static story on the screen behind them and the oral in-person storytellers telling the story in their own way, in their own costumes, with gender bending, however they want to present it. And then you have the audience callback participation feature that changes depending on what theater you're at around the world, what the period of time is. I mean, the theaters that I went to, the one I used to work at in Long Beach, they had their own specialized callbacks. And you would always know if someone came in from out of town because they'd like really wholeheartedly like participate in a callback and they're the only ones doing it. But then all it takes is one person shouting something out, and then it becomes part of the culture and it becomes part of that specific hyper localized culture of that theater. And it takes transmission to other theaters for things to morph and grow and change. And then of course you have something that came out like the 25th anniversary DVD that had a callback feature you could turn on. And so many people were like, this isn't my Rocky, like this isn't how we do it. And
it's actually a really good example.
Thank you.
Really good example.
Thank you so much.
Can I just say this
Denise
is just
commented,
like,
yes, Rocky Horror, please. We're doing it. We're doing it.
Can I just say that I feel like we should have ice cream and like a bottle of wine, and we should be in the crappy Carpinteria hotel because it feels like a Saturday night in grad school.
Yes, it does.
And I'm sad.
It does. We'll have to do some in-person happy hours.
Oh yes, that would be fantastic.
Sure.
For sure. I don't know. Do you think the world is ready for that?
I think it is, but also now I'm thinking about Adam and Eve as Brad and Janet, and like I've got a whole.
I mean, sure.
Oh my God!
I mean, okay, I'm going to be honest. I was thinking about that earlier.
Randall.
I was thinking about that earlier because we were talking about the temptation and like the sensual part of this story, and Eve tempting Adam with the loss of innocence. And guess what? Is Frankenfurter a snake? Maybe.
Kind of.
Right?
Sure. We can go with that.
He
has a snake.
He goes to Janet and takes her innocence, and then he goes to Brad and takes his innocence, and tells them both, don't tell the other what you've experienced here. Because this is it was both of their first times, and they had never had that sexual awakening before. Okay, I won't go too far into this. I'll save it for our Rocky Horror night.
I love that.
This is happening. Are we dressing up? Yes. Okay.
Oh, okay. Good to know.
I do have to say
my costume from when I was a teenager doesn't fit me anymore, so I'm gonna have to make a new one. But
oh boy.
I was Columbia. Okay.
Okay.
You'll have to dress the rest of us. I'll play along, but you have to outfit me.
Oh man, I am just, my head is spinning with possibilities.
You're not going to sleep at all tonight.
I'm not going to sleep at all. Well, also I have a 2-year-old who still nurses throughout the night, so I don't usually sleep. So I'm glad I'll have something interesting to think about.
Yeah, there you go. I will say, putting both the mythological and the folklore hat on, that they I mean, that is kind of the Joseph Campbell and the Arne Thompson kind of point about these stories, is that that is a new way of reflecting on the issues within the Adam and Eve story for that generation. Is how do we look at men and women gendered? How do we look at men, and how do we look at sexuality? How do we look at innocence? How do we look at, that kind of Beauty and the Beast moment of finding yourself and who you really are, when you then end up locked in somewhere you know, and really having to face yourself and face your fears and decide who you really are when you've got no other choice. Right?
Yeah, if you take away the heteronormative, you know, limitations of what's going on in the story, I wonder what you would come up with. Like, that's a really interesting idea just to sit and think about.
Yeah. And that was making me think, like, this foundational story is giving us the gender binary. Like,
Absolutely.
that's one role. Like, I know it does gender roles, but I didn't think, well, shit, this is giving us how we define gender from an Abrahamic perspective. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term Abrahamic, that just means religions that follow the God of Abraham, you know, of Abraham and Isaac. And I feel like that's just such a better term than saying Judeo-Christian, because that doesn't
also
describe
it
the
takes
whole
out
Abrahamic tradition, right?
Which isn't fair.
Just ridiculous. And I feel like we also didn't really fully discuss that there are two different versions of the story written down side by side in the Bible itself. And so what do we do with that information? If, okay, now we're getting into a whole theological discussion that we don't need to get into, but
well,
if the text is the truth and there's two different versions in the text, where does the truth lie? And that's not a question that any of us can really answer. But
well, I like to think of the truth and facts as two different things, which is why I love literature so much, because you can glean the truth without having to necessarily buy into the facts. And so that's how I like to approach my mythology as well.
Interesting. And that brings us back to what Kiese was saying about how we can't approach these mythological stories with our rational scientific lens, because they're two completely different belief systems, completely different value systems. Not to say that they can't coexist peacefully, but that you can't look for scientific rational evidence in a mythological story.
No, and we are focusing on the mythology of it or the story of it. We're not trying, it's not even an attempt to say whether it's true or not. We're looking at
right, and then we have stuff like biblical archaeology, right, where they're trying to track down the real Eden, or trying to find the actual Mount Sinai.
But I think that's outside our scope for these discussions. Like, we're not trying to get into all that. Yeah,
no, I agree.
We brought in the archaeology with Randall. I was gonna like tweak that just a little bit. Because obviously Plato and Aristotle both have a lot to say about rationalism, and they both have actually different viewpoints of rationalism completely. And so one of the books that I'm reading right now for dissertation is this one. It's fantastic, by the way. Seriously, really read it. Look, it's great. The Magic, a History from Alchemy to Witchcraft, from the Ice Age to the Present. And his argument is that that it's a different type of rationalism. It depends on how you define rational, because if rational is how we process our thinking and metacognition, then magic is absolutely rational. That you are having a conversation with the elements and sharing in that, you know, looking at indigenous sources, that we're creating a relationship. And now, of course, we know with global warming, of course, that we absolutely do affect in positive and negative ways the entire planet for eons and eons. So, and especially as we get to modern kinds of physics, right? That there are differences that you can't walk into a place and say we don't affect that. We're not part of that. You change once you start observing a people, a culture, a story, an element. It does change because you brought something to it with yourself. And so it's just a different kind of, it's just a different kind of rationalism. And so I always like to say that literature is better history than history, and science than science. Because what we have with literature, you look at Frankenstein or anything, we now, of course, can do exactly what she was talking about with Frankenstein. Most modern gyms have resuscitation equipment, right? The little electric things. And, you know, people have body parts sewn back on. So she was predicting where this goes, but she's asking us in a psychological way, how would this feel if we actually create this society? Is this what we should or could do with it? And so literature adds this possibility of how do we feel into this space? Is this good for us? And it adds this new layer of rationalism, really, of us being able to decide, is this good or bad? And what are we going to do then? Especially because it's predictive, right? We're predicting what's going to happen in the future. We're imagining into a different space, a different lens, or we're imagining, you know, how many of our sci-fi pieces are really about how we've treated various cultures around the world and how we should or could have done it differently. Mm-hmm. And so imagining into this place, how do we create a world in a post, you know, where we start looking at critical race theory and things like that. In a sense, in some of our sci-fi kinds of things, again, although whitewashed, we've been asking those questions for a very long time. Mm-hmm. In literature that we're only just getting around to in sociology.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. The way that I've always thought, and I know this is informed by greater thinkers who have come before me, but the quick and dirty way that I think about rational scientific thought versus mythological thought is that rational scientific thought believes that even if we don't know everything yet, everything is knowable. Mm-hmm. And is therefore like kind of controllable, right? Like the Beatles song, all you need is love. There's nothing you can know that can't be known. But with mythological thought, there's that piece saying that there are things outside of my realm of understanding because of my status as a mortal and whatever the gods have going on that I don't understand. And if we're going at this from like the foundational story of Adam and Eve, right? Our culture that was the moment our culture did believe that we can know everything that there is to know by eating that fruit. And other different religious and mythological traditions believe like, no, we can't possibly know everything that there is to know. And there are some things that are reserved just for the gods that we have to be appreciative of or follow their rules without necessarily having understanding. And I think in our modern rational scientific world, that's a terrifying thought that there are things that are unknowable and therefore uncontrollable.
Mm-hmm. And then we have the midrash, which is sort of in the middle of that, which takes the rationalism and the unknowable and tries to explain it away in a way that would be palatable to the believer. So, and a lot of that has become what people would assume it's in the Bible. Like if they haven't done a close read, like Lilith, for example, right? Or other stories, or the reasons why, or the apple, those things people just assume that are in these stories, and they're not. They've been added by these other conversations or by our friend Tertullian or Aquinas, you know, these two guys that basically said something. You know, I watched a TikTok the other day that
you don't say.
I know, it was so odd. I ended up on the spiritual and mythological side of TikTok. Weird, I know. But there's a person who goes by the name Jagazus, and he talks about Christianity and beliefs, etc. But he was really focusing on that gender idea and looking at Paul specifically. And of course, it's a theory, and you know, this is his ideas. But I found it interesting enough to remember it and, you know, peruse it. He talks about that a lot of these writers talk about sexual relationships as being evil or dirty or gross, and especially between men or women and women, that's extra gross, right, according to these people. But then then they even say that about the actual marital bed, right? That's also really gross. And so this person says Paul maybe he was asexual. Maybe he thought sex was gross. And, you know,
the way that you just said it, that was the first thing that popped into my head.
Yeah. And I just thought, you know, we've taken these structures, and I'm sure like people are dialing in right now and calling the police on me or something, but but it's an interesting idea. If we look at the gendered stereotypes and the way that we've internalized, or as to use Elizabeth Lesser's word, metabolized these stories, what if we didn't? What if we looked at them from the other ways? What if we took that framework that Kiese was talking about, or that idea that, what if Eve's story went on? What if she did get that redemption? And what would we know? And that's kind of a cool idea. What if those people looked at childbirth as an act of strength, right? Instead of an act of, ew, gross, go to your red tent and come back when you're done.
Maybe an act of individuation.
Yeah, I don't know. Just random thoughts.
I love it, and I think that's a good kind of question to end on. Like, what would that look like for Eve? What would that look like for our society if we retold her story in a way that serves her? If we offered her that redemption, what would that redemption look like? And then how would that change the way that we live our lives, or our gender roles, or our culture?
I can tell you room temperature would not be 68 degrees.
I will tell you, though, that a nod to YA genre, I think that a lot of people are testing that theory out right now. I think that's a lot of what the whole YA dystopian kind of feminist hero is really all about, whether we're talking about Hunger Games or so many other things.
Hunger Games is...
I'll give you that. I was just trying to go for popular, right?
Yeah,
for people sure. Have probably heard, seen, but
go for We Hunt the Flame. That's a better one.
But wait, I remember reading that the word sin is originally an archery term to bring Katniss into this. That's an archery term that just means to miss the mark.
Yes.
And the implication is not that you could never recover from it, but like, you didn't quite get it this time. And so even our understanding of what sin is completely different than probably what it was originally meant to be.
That's really cool. I like that.
So next week.
Yes.
Well, so can I just say too?
Finish that thought was that, like, I think that some of our women are doing that for us.
And men and non-binary. I can give you an entire list of, and I'm not saying you weren't including them. I was just saying I get excited because it's YA, and I can give you an entire list of books.
I know you're the YA girl, and so I will give you a nod to that. I will back up, however, and do a nod to me and my people. That's of course where we start with our Miss Elizabeth Bennet, is that what do we do with an intelligent woman who refuses to fit into that sphere or that program or that frame, and demands that her intelligence is respected. And so I think that women and men and everybody else have been trying that out, in a lot of ways for a long time. And I think that in a sense, we are, to loop it back around, we're finally at a place where we're hearing them in a conscious way, that we maybe were listening and bringing those stories to the front for a while and kind of thinking about them in our, consciousness, but now in a conscious, active way, we're purposely reframing and retelling those stories, and choosing to create new models. And now we need to, I think, do that for so many other individuals where we have, Black women or, Indigenous peoples or, whatever, is that we need to keep sending that story forward and making sure that everybody has a place to retell the story from their perspective.
And I think part of it is, not knowing that the walls of the container exist. And now that we've identified the walls of the container or the water that we're swimming in, and now we're maybe perhaps ready to do away with these narratives and these structures, what do we replace them with? We have to replace them with something. So we're at 7:30, and this has been freaking amazing. And obviously we could talk about this for hours and hours more, which maybe we will when we stop being live. So next week, next week, we are continuing our conversation, jumping off from Cassandra Speaks, and we are discussing Pandora. So next Monday at 6 p.m., we'll be focusing on Pandora, who she is, what her story is. Yes, thank you. Was it a box? No, it was a jar. Another translation mishap? Wild. We'll
I like
talk about
mishap.
it.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
We will
I
talk
like
about
mishap.
it. So if you want to grab this book and read along with us, it is available at fernwaycollective.org. I'll link it in the video notes. And also all the other books that we talked about. And Deb has promised to give us a nice little supplementary reading list if you're interested in doing more research on Eve.
For the digital peeps out there.
Yes, the audiobook is
yes,
fantastic.
it's also on Audible.
Yes.
Mhm.
I was
But then you can't take notes.
You guys
I'm a note taker in my books with my tabs.
I'm a note taker. I got notes all over my Audible.
Oh,
but if
you're
I listen
fancy.
to it, I'm doing other stuff. I'm like washing dishes or driving the
Yeah.
car or
Usually
like
driving.
nursing, doing
but
something where I
I'm really
can't
good.
write.
I'm really good at hitting
I don't
that.
have those magic thumbs.
Make a note.
Ooh, don't talk about thumbs. Mine are sore. Okay.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you everybody for tuning in. Please join us next week as we continue this conversation. And Kiese, did you have something to add?
I only wanted you to add who's coming to speak for Pandora, and then what's the next one after that? Is Cassandra, right?
Mm-hmm.
After that is Cassandra herself. And then there's more stuff that's going to be contained in this book. So if y'all want to have more conversations about what comes up for you in here, please feel free to reach out to us, comment, message, if there's anything that comes up in here that you would like to discuss, and we could continue these conversations. Because they're obviously a lot of fun for us.
No.
And if you feel so inclined to donate to our organization, we are a nonprofit. All of us are volunteers, and your donations help us do things like stream this video to different platforms for you to watch it. Helps with our website maintenance and upkeep and that kind of stuff. You can Venmo us at Fernway Collective, or you can PayPal us at Fernway Collective. There are links on our website, and you could donate straight through our Facebook page or Instagram as well. So just gotta give that plug. If you appreciate the education you're getting from us, throw a few bucks our way, and that would be super rad.
Super rad.
Super rad. And on that really outdated slang, say that we are out of here. So thank you to everybody, and have a wonderful night. Okay.